As we wrap up our 10th public hearing, we Commissioners would like to thank everyone who has engaged with us here in South Australia. Our time in Adelaide has been invaluable, meeting, serving and ex-serving members, hearing about the services that are helping to support them and their families. We've been buoyed by the spike in submissions we've seen over the course of this hearing block, a total of 86 submissions, including 16 from South Australia since last week. We continue to encourage anyone who wishes to share with us their experiences of military and post-military life to make a submission prior to the 13th of October this year. This Royal Commission is examining entrenched cultural, structural and systemic issues that have failed our serving and ex-serving Australian Defence Force personnel and their families for decades and led to poor mental health and wellbeing outcomes and indeed contributed to high rates of suicide and suicidal behaviour in our military community. As we approached this hearing block, we noted the findings and outcomes of the Robo-Debt Royal Commission, where Commissioner Catherine Holmes' comments in the preface to her report were instructive. I quote, "Whether a public service can be developed with sufficient robustness to ensure that something like the Robo-Debt scheme could not occur again will depend on the will of the government of the day, because culture is set from the top down." We could not agree more. The dozens of related inquiries and hundreds of recommendations that preceded this commission are testament. This hearing has focused on 5 key areas of investigation: the career path of defence members, including postings, promotions and career management, the support needs of defence members and their families, safety in the workplace, including the importance of addressing organisational and operational stresses, the link between physical injury and poor mental health outcomes, and the need for robust injury prevention approaches. The critical role that leadership and accountability at all levels plays in relation to changing culture and the impact of organisational culture and climate on mental health and well-being. And the Department of Veteran Affairs, and in particular an update on the processing of claims and a review of a pilot scheme and the veteran-centric reform program. Evidence heard during this hearing block has raised questions as to whether leadership within Defence has been taking adequate and timely action in response to the very real and pressing issues of suicides and suicidality within its ranks. We heard from Deputy Secretary Justine Gregg, PSM, about the work to be done to introduce internal reforms within the ADF and Defence to focus on better protecting and supporting members' mental health and well-being, and the many internal issues that have hindered meaningful progress in that regard, including a lack of communication, changes to organisational structure and reporting lines, diffuse accountabilities and a lack of transparency, competing and shifting priorities, commanders not receiving critical information about culture and the experience of members under their command, and a failure to meet biannual reporting deadlines on the 2018 to 2023 mental health strategy. We're concerned that the internal reforms being considered by Defence are taking too long, and there is no certainty that they will lead to meaningful improvements in members' mental health and well-being. We also heard evidence of successful programs and research being discontinued or defunded by Defence. That includes a key initiative shown to significantly reduce injury rates among military personnel and improve the reporting of injuries, which had its funding withdrawn. As Dr. Stefan Rutsky told the Commission, and I quote, "Army saw its value but did not wish to fund it because they argued that it was a health activity and therefore it should be funded by health. I sought funding from the relevant individual within the then Defence Health Organisation and was told that injuries primarily are an Army problem, not a Defence problem." The Commission heard how important it is for personnel to report their injuries to enable early intervention in order to seek better recovery outcomes. Frustratingly, we also heard about some cases where members' injuries have not been recorded by Defence, making the process of claiming benefits and pensions through DVA particularly difficult. We heard that attempts by clearance divers to offer their expertise and advice to Navy leadership on matters involving safety and the mental health and well-being of them and their peers were rebuffed, as were the Navy Clearance Divers Trust's attempts to bring critical issues to the Navy's attention, following 3 deaths by suicide within its ranks in a couple of years. The Trust's efforts to to survey the clearance diver cohort, to identify serious problems and recommend solutions and share its findings with Navy were impressive. This work comprised input from Edith Cowan University, a number of senior barristers, and most importantly, people with lived experience. It should have been a call to immediate action. Instead, we heard that the then Chief of Navy's response was to dismiss the effort as it did not strictly follow the rules for research in the ADF. It demonstrated veiled criticism of those who sought to help. This response is as damning as it is sad. I can advise that the Commission has reached out to the Navy Clearance Divers Trust in the last week to check whether they have had any follow-up from the Navy in light of the evidence presented over the course of the last two hearings. There has been no contact from Navy, only silence. That is disappointing. We heard from Professor Sharon Parker and Associate Professor Karina Jurispa about smart work, work that is stimulating, offers mastery and autonomy, and that is relational and tolerable. We heard how work redesign should ideally engage workers to achieve best results. That's not what Navy demonstrated in its response to the efforts of the Navy Clearance Divers Trust. We also heard from Associate Professor Jacqueline Drew how Defence has a moral responsibility to create a workplace that does no harm, but this requires multi-level leadership across the agency, which Defence needs to make a priority. Associate Professor Drew commented that leaders must value workers' health, demonstrate awareness of impact of workplace and model the behaviours and actions required. Retired Major General Peter Dunn, AO, spoke with authority about leadership in different contexts and noted that leaders must also communicate effectively and deliver consistent messaging across the entire organisation. It's his opinion that suicide in the defence and veteran community is a current crisis that requires leadership from the top as a priority. As I mentioned earlier, this hearing has also examined the issues affecting families of serving personnel and the systems and programs in place to help support them. We know when families are well supported and their needs prioritised, the serving member is better able to perform their duties and more likely to stay in the military. During a panel on family support last Friday, Commissioner Brown expressed her frustration at the amount of work Defence still needs to do in this vital area, particularly around childcare, domestic and family violence, improved communication, and the need for better data collection. The Supporting Service Families report, written by Sue Hamilton in 1986, identified many of these same issues, and here we are 37 years later, and we've heard that many Defence families are still doing it tough. We've heard repeatedly from ministers and service chiefs, particularly in light of the Defence Strategic Review, about Defence's people being its greatest asset. One wonders then why more has not been done to address the cultural and systemic challenges our servicemen and women face at every stage of their military career. Asked by Council Assisting to comment on the Navy's commitment to putting its people first, clearance diver Michael Maley, CSC DSM, who had a distinguished 38-year career in the Navy, told this commission, and I quote, "Look, that sounds really nice as a motto, but in my experience, it's far from the truth. The common way that I explain it is, and that many other people within Defence I've had experience with, all three services and all of the ranks, that you are simply a number and you will be replaced very quickly. That's the cut and the dry of it. It's becoming increasingly apparent that if Defence does not shift to a people-first culture, it will never meet its target of growing its workforce by approximately 30% to close to 80,000 personnel by 2040. For Defence to reach those targets, it must prioritise the mental health and well-being of those who serve." During her evidence last Wednesday, Professor Sharon Parker said, and I quote, "Creating positive, healthy work is not just going to be good for mental health and well-being, but it's also actually going to be positive for the business." And that really is what this Royal Commission is hoping to help achieve. Our end goal is to help improve the health and well-being of serving and ex-serving members. We strongly believe this will strengthen the ADF, not just its capability to protect Australia's national interests, but to attract and retain the right people. Over the last couple of days, we've again focused our attention on what the Department of Veterans Affairs is doing to better support those who served or have served or are serving. We're well aware of the significant challenges veterans and their families continue to face when trying to access entitlements, as well as much needed support services through the Department of Veteran Affairs. We note the positive impact of our interim report last August has already had, particularly in relation to the moves by government to harmonise complex legislation governing veterans' compensation and providing the DVA additional resourcing to clear the backlog of unprocessed claims, as we heard from Secretary Frame earlier today. We heard today from the Secretary of the DVA, as I mentioned, Alison Frame, about the steps taken in this space. However, we commend these steps, but we also know there is still much more to do. What can't be overlooked is that we continue to hear from many veterans about their poor experiences when seeking the support and services they desperately need and deserve. We heard from Acting Deputy Secretary Kate Pope, PSM, who was Deputy President of the Repatriation Commission, that DVA operates under the mantra that everyone who serves gets the support they need. But she later acknowledged that is not yet the reality for a whole lot of people. As I mentioned in my opening address, there will be no quick fix to these issues of defence and veteran suicide. Real and lasting reform will take time. It will also take strong leadership. As retired Major General Peter Dunn said in his evidence, and I quote, "If we're going to implement significant change, then it has to start right from the top. I would have to say included in that are our political leaders, and it is imperative that there is bipartisan support for the change." We wholeheartedly agree. I refer again to the Robo-Debt Royal Commission. In his response to the findings, the Prime Minister made a commitment to, and I quote, "making sure that it can never happen again and making sure that the government responds in an appropriate, ordered and considered way." We also note the establishment of a high-level group that will oversee and implement the necessary findings of the Robo-Debt Royal Commission. We hope for and expect the same response to our Royal Commission. There's an old saying that talk is cheap. Sadly, in regards to addressing suicide and suicidality within the defence and veteran population, there has been too much talk and not enough action, which has cost and continues to cost many lives. Our next public hearing, Hearing Block 11, will commence in Melbourne on Monday, the 28th of August, when we expect to hear evidence relating to the Inspector General of the Australian Defence Force, about the transition to civilian life, from representatives of the Victorian Government, including Premier Daniel Andrews, about cooperation between states and Commonwealth on matters related to veterans, and about supports for serving and ex-serving members in Victoria, and lived experience witnesses who will share their deeply personal stories. We can now also announce that the Royal Commission will hold a public hearing in Sydney commencing on Monday, the 20th of November 2023. Further details will be made available on our website in due course. Thank you again to everyone who has participated in this hearing and to all of those who have engaged with us here in South Australia. For those who are travelling, safe travels. I'll now adjourn.
All rise. The Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide will adjourn to Monday, the 28th of August.